All right, guys, last PowerPoint. Let's go over this. We're going to look at modern America. So the first thing we look at is Daddy Bush presidency. This is the presidency of the first George Bush, and he served from 1988 to 1992. So the three people that are running in this election all had a lot of exposure. You had George H.W. Bush, Jesse Jackson, and Michael Dukakis. All these people were really famous throughout the United States. None more than Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was a civil rights leader, and he was also part of the Democratic Party. And what happens is because Jesse Jackson didn't receive the Democratic nomination, he took a lot of votes away from Michael Dukakis, allowing George H.W. Bush to win. So what we're going to learn is that there's this time, remember I told you, throughout history we get lower and lower turnouts. This election had the lowest voter turnout yet. Only 50.1% of the voting population came out to vote. And mainly, people's attitude was really, it demonstrated the negativity of the campaign. Dukakis challenged Bush on the economy. Bush challenged Dukakis was soft on crime. And these people led such a harsh critique of each other. They basically slandered each other to make it look like no one would be right for the presidency. And that's why very few people turned out. But Bush was able to win with this one idea. He said, "Read my lips, I will not raise taxes." So he promised not to raise taxes, and people voted him for that reason. But what we're going to figure out is that's a big commitment, and he wasn't able to keep it. So basically, the Soviet society during this time was starting to open itself up. The Soviet government had to weaken its power because of, remember last week we learned that they were putting so much money into building all these new military equipment and operations that they had to weaken themselves, or they had to reduce the spending to keep people from learning all this new information that's across the world. So two major things, Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost basically meant was that they lifted media censorship and allowing people to see stuff from the outside world. And what they realized was, hey, we're really behind. We're not as advanced as the Americans. The government's lying to us. And last is Perestroika. And Perestroika was the kind of the restructuring of the government. The Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, and they allowed free election to take place in 1989. And what happened was, because of Glasnost, the Soviet government realized that, or the people realized the Soviet government was lying to them, that in the free elections in 1989, the Soviets lost. And this ended the Soviet Union. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically what happened was there was huge revolutions across Eastern Europe. When the Soviet Union fell, there's a huge power gap that people were trying to find a way to fill. They're trying to take over and get power for themselves. So what we're going to figure out is throughout the 90s, we're trying to figure out what happens in Eastern Europe. Who's going to get power? There's mainly four regions that we look at. It's Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Poland, basically the government holds elections and Poland stands together. The same thing with Hungary. Both these nations stand strong, but because they're so close to the West, a lot of the people in Poland and Hungary basically pack up and go to Germany and live in the West. Czechoslovakia, on the other hand, had a revolution, and it's called the Velvet Revolution. It was a non-violent, but still very dramatic shift, where Czechoslovakia became one of the most liberal nations of this bloc. And Romania, on the other hand, it had another revolution, but it was a violent revolution, and it brought down by force the Soviet government. So like we talked about last week, the Berlin Wall falls, and the Berlin Wall signifies that strong Soviet hold. And when the wall falls, that signifies the end. And it really was. It was the end. So we're going to skip this. This is just basically what I was saying, that starting in the 1990s, the Soviets are withdrawing, and they're trying to make it seem that they're allowing people to vote. But they're really just falling left and right. Two main things to note here. Not only was this a major political strife for Russia, but it was also for China and Panama. China, a democratic uprising was happening. People were trying to fight for democratic rights. And this was really famous in what people saw the Tiananmen Square, where this the one guy standing with his hand up against all the tanks coming at him, and it was a huge pro-democracy demonstration. Basically, what you see is that the guy stands up and tries to block the tank with his hands. That's what you see, and basically what it was this nonviolent protest. But what happens is what you don't see is that after immediately he holds his hand up, stop the tanks, people were killed. Hundreds of people were shot and killed with military small arm fire from rifles and tanks. And it quickly ends the Chinese Democratic Rebellion. Panama had a brutal dictator. And what happened was the United States was keeping him supported because they wanted to continue to use the Panama Canal. But in 1989, Noriega declared a state of war with the United States. That was the rebellion, and he was quickly eliminated. Basically, Noriega soldiers killed a U.S. Marine, and then the U.S. Marines and Secret Services went in kind of legally, grabbed him, took him to Florida, and he was not heard from for a while. So Bush actually has to go through two conflicts: the South African New Freedom and the Persian Gulf War. The main thing I'm going to focus on, South African New Freedom is really important. I gave the information, but what you're going to see on an AP test and the U.S. history test is a Persian Gulf War. Basically, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, and Kuwait was a really big ally with America and the UN. So the UN imposes sanctions on Saddam that says, we're going to punish you, and you got here by this time. But he didn't. So Bush went on Operation Desert Storm, and Bush was able to attack into Kuwait, quickly eliminate the Saddam's forces, and win the war in 7 hours. It's a massive victory. So what's the main thing? The main important about the 1980s. The 1980s and early 1990s saw a major technological, economic, and social change that brought a lot of conflicts. So these reading focuses what I have for you. You're going to see those in your reading questions after I get done lecturing to you. So there's some major new technologies. First is Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. We all know these guys, but these guys took on major innovations. They're the ones that said people will want computers at home. People want to be able to use computers for fun instead of just having big, massive computers at the work. So Steve Jobs created Apple and Bill Gates created Microsoft. They're both still competing today. The space shuttle. Unlike previous spacecrafts, we created the space shuttle. And what space shuttle was, it could be used over and over and over and over again. But we haven't really made it well enough. There are still some kinks to go through. And unfortunately, the space Challenger was destroyed in 1980s, and it was destroyed right after launch. Another one in Texas in 2004 was coming across the sky right over Dallas, and it blew up while it was flying to land. So how did 1980s affect various groups? There was uneven economic growth. The really rich grew dramatically. The really poor stayed very poor. Rising deficits. The government was spending more money than it made, and because of that, we weren't able to create adequate growth. So that's a major problem. We're still doing it today. We're up to like $18 trillion in debt, and it's not improving. Financial deregulation. Basically, we saw the government starting to weaken its regulations, and there's a savings and loan crisis. People were putting too much of their wealth into savings, bills, and loans, and what eventually happened was these collapsed and caused a lot of people to have problems. Okay, we kind of talked about this deregulation, the cuts. So what happened? What are some challenges to the U.S. economy? Mainly milestones for women. Politicians began to pay more and more attention to women. Before this time, they voted, but didn't turn out in large numbers. But in the 80s and 90s, we saw that these women voters became very crucial, and what they needed and what they wanted began to be heard. Change the immigration law. People realized that the immigration system was broke, and we knew that we needed to fix it, and that became an obvious focus in the 90s. And basically, deadly diseases started to come into play as well. Primarily AIDS. It's one of the world's worst outbreaks of infectious disease, and we're still trying to figure out what's going on and how can we stop it today. All right, guys. So tomorrow we're actually gonna dive in and look at Clinton's presidency. That's gonna be what happens with Bush is that he actually loses the election because he's forced to raise taxes. The economy is going poorly for Bush, and he's forced to raise taxes to try to do a band-aid gap. But because he's seen as a warmonger, because he goes to war in the Middle East, he sends troops. Or he keeps on increasing the U.S. military against the Soviet Union that already collapsed, and he goes back on his promise about the economy. No one trusts him, and because of that, he loses decisively to this new, a very charismatic guy from Arkansas, and his name will be Bill Slick Willie Clinton. All right, I'll see y'all tomorrow.